Once and again validated by his people, born statesman, spokesman that helped to build new poles of power. If there is an expression that advances multipolarity, it's not other than rescue and safeguard our identity, our history, our world, the world of the poor. The world must change. It must not commit suicide, and another world is possible only if we make it possible. That's what he believed in. Several times he talked about the challenge of the great Latin American Caribbean alliance. He was also concerned for the extra-regional bonds and the equation of union, energy, and food. He knew that there was a geopolitics that was different to unipolarity. He visited the entire world and signed tens of agreements with a broad global vision. Chavez, the great builder of a new international geopolicy. This is our critical move today. We will visit news, history, and also actors involved. On March 5, 2019, we are remembering 6 years of the physical death of Hugo Chavez Frias. Once again, the people will visit the place where Commander rests, located in Paris, 23 de enero, with different expressions of love, discussions, videos, music, activities, conferences, sports. The people honors the man who founded the Republic with a new constitution, redistributed wealth with a broad range of social programs, and struggled to make Venezuela a country power respected by all the countries of the world, and who saw this power as something related not only to economy and production, but also with transforming social aspects. We must create a zone of peace in Latin America and the Caribbean. Any way of interference must end by the empires. And NECLAC is the most powerful tool, potentially most powerful. For me, this is a dream. I love him. It's a love, a motherly love. We just arrived in a bus. We had a trip of 11 hours to say goodbye once again to Hugo Chavez Frias. His vision went beyond the Venezuelan borders as a strategist, but with the same intensity, as he worked for the country, he also helped the oppressed abroad. He articulated countries based on respect and self-determination. Let's review this video that talks about Chavez, the integrator of Latin America, Caribbean, and the world. One of the core axes of Hugo Chavez's foreign policy was the creation of alternative power poles against the hegemony of the United States. Together with the Cuban Revolution's leader, Fidel Castro, he proposed a regional mechanism that is called ALBA-TCP. Born formally in December 2004 in Havana as a space for the equitable development of all involved nations under regional complementarity, mutual respect, and solidarity. One of the foundation bases is Bolivar's Jamaica Charter. Together with Néstor Kirchner, Evo Morales, Ignacio da Silva, Lula da Silva in 2005, he insisted on this. In several summits, the Bolivarian leader had opposed the asymmetric world trade imposed by the United States. In 2005, also, Chavez announced the creation of Telesur to break the media silence of the great hegemonic chains and show the reality of the peoples, that facts that are not broadcast by the other main media. It was a milestone also, the creation of Petrocaribe in June 2005, an alliance between Venezuela and several Caribbean countries to overcome energy inequalities through equitable agreements and solidarity agreements for many countries, many condemned by their colonies. It includes gas, electricity, technological cooperation, training, and infrastructure development. UNASUR was another key of integration created in May 2008. It became a space of social, political integrity based on the essential needs of the people. Another fact that was a milestone created by Chavez was the geostrategic importance of the oil strip of the Orinoco, with diverse participants and purchasers, the incorporations of Asian, Africa, and Middle Eastern countries. The Regional Cooperation Forum, without the influence of the United States and Canada, was also established in 2010. ECLAC was born in Caracas. In July, in Brasilia, July 2012, another goal traced by Chavez took place in Brasilia, which was the incorporation of Venezuela to Mercosur. Extra-regional alliances were created also with other countries. We will now visit web pages, and I start by the Venezuelan News Agency under the title Teachings of Chavez Are Antidotes to Foreign Interference, that collects testimonies that allow us to describe Chavez as the great builder of the new international policy. Whoever you ask, he describes him as a master of solidarity. Our master died in 2013, but planted ideals in our land, and during 4 decades he suffered a neoliberal and excluding policy. The greatest teaching was to be sensible. Chavez promoted me to struggle for the people and speak for the voices that still fear, and share even what I don't have in my community. He taught me to organize, to become the neighborhood's communicator and struggle for what we love the most, which is our nation. For this journalist, Chavez's ideas are symbols of strength now that Venezuela is subject to a foreign attack. I now go to research and analysis webpage Misión Verdad. Venezuela. United States seeks a solution to its systemic crisis and geopolitical fall. This article is written in 2018. Venezuela is in the midst of a global dispute, and the United States wishes to continue hegemonizing the world with China and Russia beside. And it wants to recover world power in Washington. The rising cycle of the U.S. power mobilizes war against Venezuela and makes it known with financial pressure and intentional destruction of the national economy, the urgence of Venezuela's revolution fall. I now go to telesurtv.net, Chavez, the geopolitical strategist. This is an opinion note of Nidia Grempinto, internationalist, expert in foreign affairs, national security, and militarization. She writes for several different newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV shows. She is expert in intelligence. He never promoted war. Hugo Chavez's ethical strength went together with his knowledge to destroy U.S. imperialism in favor of Latin American peoples, which will never again be the slaves of the power. Chavez also struggled to shorten the expoliation of energy and natural resources by foreign corporations. Chavez was considered a reinventor of the geopolitics of new conditions with which Latin America and the Caribbean inaugurated the 20th century. His political project promoted these countries to dismantle colonial structure and build an unprecedented process of integration with novel institutions, which we already mentioned some minutes ago, promoted by Hugo Chavez since he arrived to power in 1999 after elections. Today is the day of homage, 6 years of his death, and this is why we are looking at how he was a great builder of the new international geopolitics. For this, we have Luis Tavera, our correspondent. Greetings for you, Lucia, and the audience of Telesur. 6 years of Commander's Hugo Chavez's departure, and his strategies are still active and have also been references for other governments. And this has been emphasized by other countries like Russia, China, and Turkey, who have reminded us how President Chavez, since his arrival to power in Venezuela, was directly concerned for optimizing social protection, and these missions that today are a world reference regarding the socialist model that already has 20 years of existence in Venezuela. Many analysts talk about this international attack against the socialist model that promoted social growth, political awareness, and civic military union. And these are the components that, according to analysts, have been the stone in the shoe of empires like the United States that has never stopped in identifying and stabilizing plans, especially through a reborn Monroe Doctrine. This is why this scenario of defense of sovereignty and what the Bolivarian Revolution has meant in all these years is still here. We now remember 6 years of his passing away on the streets. We now see what these activities will be to remember these 6 years. We call it plantation because Venezuelans have always called President Chavez as a promoter of inclusion and visibilization of the voices of the poor that now have social missions and have been references in international organizations like ALBA, ECLAC, and have been scenarios to defend themselves from organizations promoted by the United States. And today we see how the Venezuelan minister Jorge Arraza has reported how these organizations have prepared a scenario against Venezuela. Many characteristics are remembered for Chavez, like social activities, and now we are looking at that on the streets of Venezuela. And we see why it is important to maintain this Bolivarian Revolution. We wonder what is the status of that world geopolitics that Commander Hugo Chavez struggled to build since he arrived to power. There are several variants, but there are aspects or items that remain the same. We will analyze them after this pause. Chavez, the great builder of a new international geopolitics. This is our critical move today on March 5, 2019. We review resumenlatinoamericano.org with the interview made by Carlos Alnar to João Pedro Stedile under the title, Venezuela is very important because it's the battle of the century. This is a quote of João Pedro Stedile. And in this interview with Aznares, if the vision is to bring down Venezuela, they will have to do it with Cuba, Nicaragua, and others. It's very important to turn it into a resistance wall and make it the Tom, at least, of Donald Trump. Our evaluation is that there is a deep crisis of the capitalistic model, and the solution they are envisioning to resolve their corporations in accumulation is take over in a more offensive way of natural resources, whether it's mining, oil, water, biodiversity, and increase the working class exploitation by eliminating historic rights conquested throughout after the Second World War. This was how Carlos Aznares answered questions in this interview in the International Assembly of the Peoples held in Caracas. Commander Hugo Chavez designed for a mandate that he didn't finish because of his death, a plan called Nations Plan, expanded during Nicolas Maduro's first term. And in this charter, there are 5 macro goals interconnected among each other that show Chavez's geopolitical vision. The first is to defend, expand, and consolidate the most precious good reconquested after 200 years, national independence. The second is continue building the Bolivarian socialism as a defense of savage capitalism. The third is to turn Venezuela in the social, economic, and cultural power of Latin America and the Caribbean to guarantee a zone of peace in America. Fourth, contribute to developing a new international policy whereby the multicentric and pluripolar world guarantees the peace in the planet. Chavez opposed neoliberal organizations that take over international corporations that threaten to disarticulate many countries and centralize production and generate perverse logics to minimize production costs. He was contrary to the globalization that turned the countries unable to decide on their own policies. For Chavez, the integration of forces will allow us to be free from the international financial institutions, and he thought that the peoples must integrate first, the souls, he said. It's not competition, but cooperation. Each one will provide the best of themselves. And he saw harmonic development and overcoming asymmetries. We will now add our guests for today from Anzoátegui, Venezuela, Romero Harrington, international analyst, greeting, and from Buenos Aires, Argentina, Estela Caloni, journalist, writer, and international political analyst. Welcome, you too. I start with Orlando. I think I have a better communication with you. As soon as he started, Commander Hugo Chavez launched the policy of continental unity. In your opinion, did Chavez give light to a new international policy, and how would you describe it? Hello, Lucia. Greetings for you and your prestigious international audience. I think that more than geopolitics, what Chavez meant was the rupture of authoritarian speech that also is linked to politics and economy. I was just talking with Geraldine about the end of postmodernism. And when Chavez was born as a phenomenon of the world policy, there was an established policy, especially that of Mr. Fukuyama, that predicted the end of history. They were talking about the imposition of the capitalistic system as a hegemonic international axis in the world, and the last system, liberalism, as the last effective system for the cuspid of the summit of humanity, and also liberalism as an economic axis among the countries. The arrival of Chavez broke this speech and meant a rupture and a new way of relating, especially in the continent and in the world. What Chavez did, because we recognize Maduro as the son of Chavez and his continuum, is to establish the basis of a quantic leap from the New World Order to a multilateralism, a multipolar world order, and new forces and actors that were invisibilized before, not because they couldn't alter the course of history, but because they were invisibilized in the media. So, of course, what Chavez did, it's not that Chavez is the founder, but he was the visible head in the world, known by unifying with non-commercial bonds, as the neoliberalism did, the U.S. government. But these are deep bonds that are articulated in the organic tissue of the countries upon social movements, social organizations, and different cultural expressions of any kind. He was not a founder, but he was a leader of a new policy with a quantic leap, you say. Commander Chavez favored the arrival of new actors in the world scene. I would like to ask you, Estela, we are now remembering Hugo Chavez after 6 years of his decease. I would like to listen to your opinions. Thank you. Good morning, Lucia. Thank you, and our dear viewers of Telesur. I would like to say that President Chavez arrived in 1994, July. I interviewed him in a very long and beautiful interview where he was already talking about Latin American unity, which was a proposal he brought with himself, as well as many other elements, the recovery of Bolivar, very important, the identity of Simon Bolivar, Martian thought. All this is, he spoke of all this at that time. And when he arrived to office, he made a very interesting thing, the proposal of a new constitution, because he knew that without that new constitution, he would be unable to build anything for his country. Because our constitutions in all our countries come from old times and have nothing to do with a project like his, which was a project that arrived in a historic period, 1988-1989, the Great Popular Rebellion, riots in Latin America, where the peoples wrote a history that had been forgotten, and nevertheless Chavez visibilized it immediately. It is very important because first it was a neoliberal appraisal with the Caracazo 1989. Commander Chavez took that movement, and in 1992 he protested in a civic military protest and marked an important political line. At the time of that constitutional change, he was saying another republic is born, and this allows him to take these giant steps in favor of unity. And at the time he is collecting popular rebellion, and we should underline that historic moment because extraordinary popular struggles took place against neoliberalism. I think that consciously or not, they were based on that first Caracazo. And it took, it was performed organized or not, but it was the defeat of neoliberalism on the streets and roads of Latin America. Those movements gave birth to new governments that came to accompany Chavez in this new project of Latin American unit. And I think I have to note something that is very important. Since Chavez was in office, the United States was already talking about the return of the Monroe Doctrine. In the Santa Fe document 2000, they started with the Monroe Doctrine. And Chavez started with Bolivarianism. If we place ourselves in the 19th century, when the United States started its expansion project, Simón Bolívar appeared, the Congress of Panama, Latin American Unit. So all this that Chavez will take in his hands when these new governments start appearing, Chavez not only implemented the project of Latin American unity, where he left aside economic Mercosur that would die soon, because he proposed a cultural, political unit very deep and unite Latin America in this very strong bloc to resist this historic period they were preparing us for. Not only that, but Commander Chavez created the counter-hegemonic thought of the 21st century, the Bolivarianism, as the seed of all this project of national dignity, Latin American nationality that together with Commander Fidel Castro Ruz, when they met, that project of the three roots and everything he brought with himself, an extraordinary load of information. This root started growing and this historic period began with this counter-hegemonic thought, Bolivarianism, that is even taken over by the Europeans. And since they advised our parents, now the children of those who wanted to advise us as our parents saw this extraordinary model of resistance for this 21st century. Because what is best than sovereign unity? Because what was the Latin American project proposed by Chavez, and that would be at the time of the arrival of Néstor Kirchner in Argentina, Lula da Silva in Brazil, and later Evo Morales in Bolivia. And this project continued growing. It was unbelievable because nobody tells that these presidents were born with the peoples on the streets. And this is why they were popular movements and started to make truly elections that were truly ours, because elections had always been mishandled. So when they came, they made truly democratic elections. What did Chavez strive on? The people's participation. These were, for the first time in the history of America, truly democratic elections with no one purchasing the vote. What Chavez said, popular participation. It was extraordinary. It was like a geopolitically clear dawn, because it was dawn of dear resistance to the project that the United States was bringing at that time. In 1992, when Chavez came through, and United States, through Bolivarian said that it was the time for the United States to expand throughout the world with global governance, and they could take over because they no longer had their counterweight contract with the Soviet Union. So the appearance of Chavez in history is essentially, and as our peer just said, he broke all schemes, and another historic period started. And what do they want to start right now? Because the integration of Latin America that cannot be understood in Europe, because there's a Eurocentric thought that is not ours. Ours is a thought of liberation, because Chavez knew about it. He talked about the new true independence, because the first one was cut at the beginning of the 20th century with the expansion of the United States. So look at the time we are living now, what meant the appearance of Chavez at that time, that also continued to with all the Martian project and all this lonely policy. And look at how the Latin American panorama changed and started appearing in the world. Venezuela appeared for the first time in the world. There is an extraordinary rebirth. This is why the strongest coup, because they want to go to throw this project away, the emancipation of Latin America versus the geostrategic project of recolonizing Latin America. Rebirth versus colonization. I would like to ask Orlando in this road, in this tissue of relations and these historic counter-hegemonic roots that Estela is explaining, have there been step backs? How are we now in Venezuela as a center of new battles? It's an interesting question, because anybody could interpret as a step back from since Chavez to this time, because some governments have lost power. Some governors that responded, allegedly responded to leftist governments, Argentina, Brazil, and even Ecuador. Since the death of Commander, many dare to say that these governments have fallen in disgrace because of a series of factors we all know today, but I would dare to say that the most recurrent and most important factor is the lack of social tissue, the lack of popular support and integration, and the effects of their policies is the popular mass, the people of each country. We're talking about the fall of Cristina Kirchner, Lula, now in jail, the fall of Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and simultaneous disappearance in the media of some political, social, and cultural movements that existed in Latin America. What happened here, somebody said, with Chavez's legacy and all this strong work, hard work that of Hugo Chavez today, what happens is that the nations that have resistance is because their leaders are born in the political ideological combat in each country. What is happening in Bolivia, for example? Bolivia remains with President Evo Morales because he was born and belongs to the majoritarian social class of the people. In Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro remains in spite of all adversities. But these positions of combat against the League at this time are due to the fact that the Venezuelan, the Nicaraguan people support their presidents directly, and all the policies that were born after the combat against imperialism. So to talk about the geopolitical situation in the continent, we would have to talk also of the progress that neoliberalism has made in each country and territory. So what we are looking now, for now, is a step back, and for me is the transparency of the movements in the continent. So now we know who share leftist ideals and who don't. We have identified the enemy clearly. Social, political, and cultural movements in Latin America know that they are governed, as the case may be, in right-wing and neoliberal governments. So in spite of some people talking about step-backs of the policies of Commander Chavez, I think we are living a battle that will be very intense. We are starting a continental revolution that will sweep each neoliberal government that has dared to delete the leftist policies of each territory. We will now make a pause and retake some data. Estela told us that the refoundation of the Republic of the National Constituent Assembly in 1999, and therefore the popular approval of the new Constitution, marks a sound basis of what we are talking about, that Hugo Chavez started to build. Two articles, 152, International Relations of the Republic responds to the purposes of the state according to sovereignty and the interests of the people, independence and equality among the states, free determination and non-intervention in internal matters. And 153 that expressly says that the Republic will promote Latin American Caribbean integration for the creation of a community of nations to defend common and social goals. Well, we must ask if the policy that Chavez started building 20 years ago is functional to the situation that Venezuela is confronting right now. We will make a pause. Estela Orlando will be back.
Estamos hablando de Chavez como el
gran edificador as the great builder of a new international geopolitics. It's important to understand that the current geopolitics has unblocked new violent methods that, in spite of 20 years of continued boycott, has maintained its revolution. Some keys of the current panorama to proceed with the analysis. On February 23, the people defeated the intent of passing an alleged humanitarian aid that was just a military intervention that paradoxically was burnt by opponent mercenaries. Nevertheless, if the threatening speech of the military power would like to re-establish relations in Venezuela, a brutal media operation and traditional media and social networks that tries to tell things that are not true. The U.S. government commands the plan this hour. They are attacking through several fronts, and it seems that they only believe in democracy, peace, and human rights, but it's all the contrary. Trump is interested in Venezuela's resources. The governments of Russia and China have clarified that they respect the free determination. Recently, Russian ambassador in Venezuela said that his country will respond harshly if the democracy in Venezuela is violated. New tensions were diluted with the entrance of the self-proclaimed Juan Guaidó, self-proclaimed president, even if he has committed with several crimes. Nelcy Rodriguez explained that the corresponding measures would be taken in due time, and that this is an anti-constitutional farce. Let's continue with our guests. From Argentina and Venezuela. Venezuela is on the way to defeating this new coup, or is this a new phase of the coup? Well, there are very interesting things to analyze at this time. The U.S. project of recolonization of Latin America to appropriate all the resources. They started talking about Patriot Zero. I just heard that the Monroe Doctrine was meant that consider Latin America as a backyard. But what has happened? First of all, Chavez created impressive roads and facts. On one hand, we have Cuba that has resisted more than 60 years to the attempts of the total destruction that the United States planned. It is the longest blockade of the world. It's a medieval process. So this is a resistance model. And why Venezuela? First, because Chavez unblocked bureaucracies in Venezuela. He was giving us an example that at a given time, through certain ministries of the old bureaucratic teachings, he had the Robinson mission, all those missions you know well that he created. That was an extraordinarily novel act and a revolutionary boldness. A lo presidente, it seemed this president talking with hello president, with Chavez going town by town, showing what was a lie and what was true. He made a huge popular education that broke all molds existing until then. And as Cuba created its media to be able to counteract such enemy campaign, now redoubled with the new technologies, Chavez's creation of the communication, the new communication media, community TV, radio, community TV, Telesur, this is extraordinary because at this time there is no other country that is best in Latin America and the continent is so informed as the Venezuelan people is. Nobody. The Venezuelan people has its defenses in this way. There are many elements, and I placed as an example for the people, which is very different. To work and continue resist with informed people and not people that are entertained by uninformation and lies. So the people is giving an example of freedom of thought. So this is extraordinary. Why does Venezuela resist? Because of all of these reasons. Where has there been such important participation? We saw, for example, in Cuba, why couldn't they destroy Nicaragua? Because the historic period when President Ortega governed, any critique can be made, but they can't say that what he did with the Nicaraguan people are clear facts. So why do they want to destroy Nicaragua? ALBA, that was the creation, an extraordinary creation, because we knew that these other organizations, there were possibilities of the empire interfering, but ALBA has not been able to destroy. Why do they want to destroy Nicaragua? Because it has a clear foreign policy. Venezuela, because it's the example for Latin America. As our peer said before, we went from unilaterality to multilaterality with a huge presence of Latin America in the world. And even if we measure, we analyze why many places stepped back, because in those places they didn't understand what they were struggling against. For Chavez, anti-imperialism was immediately a firm position. Because perhaps you didn't notice who you were struggling against, and sometimes the people didn't participate as they did here. But what is happening in Argentina, the popular resistance, is a lesson of other times. Unfortunately, I have only 1 minute to give the floor to Orlando in Venezuela. You believe there has been a step back in the construction of liberation and the U.S. expansion. Has there? I ask you, do you think sound alliances that are still there are some kind of containment wall at this time of new threats against Venezuela? Yes, Lucia, of course, it is a containment wall. The UN, the two main powers of the world, talked about creating a war scenario in Venezuela. Regional alliances, especially internal in our continent, have allowed us to keep a more or less stable situation in what could be considered stable in an economic war of food and medicines. And diplomatic relations established by Bolivarian socialism allow us to keep our independence and dignity versus the most important empire of the world, and in a very short time. But these are not the reasons why Venezuela resists and Nicolás Maduro remains as president. There are many reasons, and in a short time I would emphasize on the military doctrine, the effectiveness of economic, social policies of Venezuelan government, which are verifiable. And third, but not least, the cultural resistance of the people versus the media war. We've had 20 years of media war where Venezuela has been a world laboratory of psychological expositions of the U.S. government against the Venezuelan people that have produced a generation of Venezuelans, unfortunately, we have to say, with psychological conditions that must go to the hospital. So we are battling, and I repeat, against the most powerful empire of the world, but we don't fear it. We continue knowing that our people is the main weapon in this war, that, I repeat, is not personal, is not continental. It is a war to keep our dignity and find a solution to the confrontation of capitalism with all the countries. These are not only words, there are facts that are materialized. Thank you very much, Estela Orlando, for being with us. We don't have much time, but we will continue analyzing. As conclusion, we'd like to talk about rebirth of Hugo Chavez, who broke all schemes towards the final liberation, the second and final independence after the first in the 20th century. The struggle continues with the revolution that he left as legacy, and his purpose was complete disruption, a quantum leap. He favored the eruption of new actors and factors based always on the ideas of Bolívar, Martí, and others. He became an accelerator of the geopolitics and as the relation of man with geography. And the revolution proposes placing resources in favor of the people. And this is what is part of the current dispute in Venezuela. We are at the end of our program today. Thank you.